My thesis is titled Newness in Architecture, From Collective Unconscious to Sacred Place in the Experience of Travel. Diagram, primarily what I'm showing is two paths converging in the design of an airport. And the one path that's been established by the airport is the epitome of the mind-body relationship. It's a moving process of the body with relatively little respect for the spiritual animation of that body. So, question, what the heck is newness? A quality of spiritual experience typically induced by power greater than yourself, a power that makes you wonder, and the word wonder and what that does, and it opens up. And so, kind of that power that can come through architecture, very well thought out plan work of humans for nature, the work of the earth, the system we live in. Some of the minds that contributed to my research, beginning with Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell, Christian Norberg Schultz, Kenneth Frampton, Johanna Plasma, Christopher Alexander, and then some of the architects who I included in my precedent study, Louis Kahn, Renzo Piano, and Ted Allende. Three of the books that I reviewed and formed a big chunk of the foundation of this thesis were The Architecture of Happiness, The Eyes of the Skin by Johanna Plasma, and The Temple in the House by Anthony Waller. And I also included some of the additional resources for the design of an airport. Moving into analysis, the construct of the psyche that I'm working with is based on Carl Jung's research, where at the outermost collective commonality of human, the collective unconscious, and the archetypes that compose that make themselves illustrated into consciousness. So the second layer, personal unconscious, that has to do with your personal experiences, and then the center of ego, your conscious state of mind. And so the archetypes and what we all have in common, the anima-animus that is that feminine masculine relationship, and these are kind of human characteristics that become manifest in our architecture. So what I did is I had translation exercises where I'm kind of working with taking qualities and trying to express qualities. They're not necessarily going to be utilized in the design of an airport, but they're exercises for me to kind of figure out how I can express different qualities in this one. The first exercise I looked at matrixing senses and primal elements together to derive kind of quality, different qualities, and then making those manifest in form. And I'm still working on it. It's in progress, but it's something that I think is going to help me in my analysis of looking at different spaces and trying to figure out how our five senses and the five elements that we have are going to be manifest in the building. So these are kind of the last piece of my analysis of putting together a catalog of elements and principles. And so I come from the 5 primal and I branch out to 8 architectural form elements. And it's a catalog, so it's something I can use and then working with the principles of sequence and place in sacred. And moving into precedent, looking for architecture that embodies that power that makes you wonder. And these are the 4 works that I'm reviewing. The Chagall Center in New Caledonia by Renzo Piano, the MIT Chapel by Eros Saarinen, the Salk Institute by Louis Kahn, and the Church on the Water by Down Under. So I moved into the airport today, and I was looking for how, in our current line of code and regulation in air travel, how can we implement the newness, that quality? And so I found a site. This was a proposal by the state of Alabama some 20 years ago for an airport in St. Clair County, Alabama, northeast of Birmingham. And it was to serve as a supplement for the air traffic in Atlanta. And it's practically only become more feasible today with the amount of air traffic. And so I'm showing a link to surrounding cities. And then the local context, you have Chandler Mountain, and you have Canoe Creek. And this is just showing where I limited my boundary to the United States for our codes, and then within that, all of the different sites I looked at, starting with, and I just remodeled an existing terminal, and what that did was it didn't allow me the space to respond. Existing airports are built as machines, and there's not enough room there to explore the Thesis. And then economic engines in the area that tie to the feasibility of the airport site, and automotive industry primarily, with all the new Volkswagen plant going in Chattahoochee. And then you have Discovery International is out up in Huntsville, also alongside Toyota. Kia's down in Columbus, Hyundai is in Montgomery, Mercedes is outside Birmingham, and Honda is just south of the site. So they all tie together. And then also Airbus just proposed, or just decided last year that they're going to build their A320 plant in Mobile. So it's just kind of a situation right now that ties to the site. And then, so looking at the characteristics of the site, how I'm going to build it. With an airport, it starts with the runways. You can't do anything without knowing exactly how your runways need to be laid out for the prevailing winds at any given time in the year. So you go, and this is where I learned about airports initially. I went back 10 years, 2003 to 2013, and created a windrows, and that windrows gives me prevailing winds at any given time. And then what you have is a crosswind component, and that's what you're looking for. So you need to know how many knots, and you need to know design aircraft. So I used the Airbus A380, which is the largest aircraft in the world right now, passengers, and it's an international flight primarily used. And then also going down to the smaller regional flights. And so I use a 10.5 knot crosswind component and in my runway orientation. That's practically where I am right now. For a program, tying into a high-speed rail that links these cities and Birmingham, Atlanta, all the way out maybe to New Orleans and up to South Carolina and maybe further up the East Coast. But just hypothetical, but having stop along that high-speed rail line, tied in with the airport, and then having a hotel, conference room, or convention center, kind of small, available for use at the airport. That's it.
Yes.
That's what I gathered, yeah, and I think it's interesting that you chose airports, I did not know, even in our conversations, I did not know that. It's a good one. I'm wondering, what did you look, I'm sure you looked at lots of airports, and did you find one that you thought was maybe came close to something that you?
I did not.
Did
I found ones that made very good attempts, and maybe in bringing this element of spirit space, they bring in art. This is Vancouver.
Okay, but you know what you need to do is go outside of the US, because Singapore,
This is
unbelievable.
people-
Has anybody ever been to Singapore?
Yep, this is Singapore right here.
Okay, yeah, oh my God, the orchids and that place is like a greenhouse, it's just unbelievable. And the other is the Rands at Piano redid the deli. And that's just, it's just amazing. Have you seen that? The Delhi International? Delhi, India, I'm sorry, India.
I think that came up. I didn't see maybe some of the spirit place of it. I don't know. Maybe I haven't seen it.
Okay.
To me, an obvious issue, which I'm sure you and Roy are aware of, is project scale versus thesis theme. There's a quicksand here that I think is important to navigate skillfully, and it's the technical, conventional design of the airport versus the amount of attention you're going to give to thematic incorporation. And I'm hoping that in your desire to take on something to scale, which I know you wanted this big so you had a bigger canvas to do your thesis theme on, that you not get bogged down in the techniques of the airport to the detriment of incorporating your thesis theme. Because your thesis theme implies not just overarching conceptual treatments, it involves very particular environmental strategies and details that I'm hoping you're going to get.
Ian, are you, I'm sorry I missed the first part, are you designing an airport, or are you designing like a pattern language book or a?
It is an airport, but it's serving as a prototype. It's kind of visionary. It's conceptual design. I think I'm not kind of like Professor White was just saying about not getting bogged down with every technical aspect, all the way down to baggage claim and everything. But having space there, making sure it will be functional, but primarily designing the spaces of the passenger experience through the airport. Primarily focusing on departing passengers, because that's where the passengers spend the most time waiting for an airplane, waiting to go through security, waiting to get seated.
I think some of these,
Why do you even need to design an airport in a natural site and worry about the runways and worry about all the things that are involved in an airport when your real interest is only in a few of the spaces? You're not really worrying about the back of the room parts, you're not worrying about a lot of different parts. So are you gonna kind of do a very, very schematic treatment of everything except those areas that the passengers who are departing are going to encounter, and those you're going to do somehow at a level of detail where we can experience what you're showing us, where you're giving us a fully rendered 3D experience of those places? Because that's what you need in order to sell the idea of that spirit of that particular place.
Right, and that's exactly. It's the development of those spaces, the passenger experience. What I found when I looked at just doing the spaces of a passenger experience, kind of remodeling an existing terminal in Atlanta or JFK or LAX or one of these airports, they don't have the space to implement a renovation with this type of respect.
You know, there's nothing that says that your thesis has to be an entire project. It could be a part of a project. It could be only those areas of an airport, which might be regional, but not in a particular location. You might need to know the region and the country and so on, but not that it's in that particular piece of land in that particular location.
Well, possibly.
Well,
I
I'm just
know-
trying to make it easier for him.
Right,
That's actually,
I agree with all the things being said, that you should not get bogged down in planning. It should be about this luminous, phenomenological quality of space. I think the location region may have something to do with that.
It is,
Yeah.
region.
I think your research, these examples point in the direction right here. You know, you look at the SOC, it's a laboratory. It's not celebrated, it's interstitial floors and all that are very innovative at laboratories. What it really is about in terms of your thesis is that very spiritual space that is so celebrated. Or pianos, cultural center. You know, and that does tie to the culture of the region and history. But still, you know, it's the architecture is so poetic that it begins to take on this spiritual quality. So that's the real part of the matter. That the airport's kind of secondary, really. I mean, it happens to be an airport. It could be a cultural center. It could be a laboratory.
I like the idea of the airport only, and I agree with you, but only in the sense that I just think there's so many people experience, you know, I mean, you would think church, I mean, how could you apply this? Everybody experiences an airport at some point, most everyone does. And it's kind of a generic space, it's a horrible place in most cases. It's a, you know,
We're working on the New Orleans airport. We call it a tube for people.
Yeah, it's a horrible
It's like
place.
water pipes for people.
So I love the concept of let's, you know, try to bring something that is wonderful.
Right, and that's the challenge, to
The
bring
challenge.
this notion of a much more uplifting space or series of spaces to a place that doesn't have it.
Right.
So I think that's legitimate too. It's just, it might be your habit, let's say, to get more bogged down in a lot of technical details. That's something you should not do.
There's kind of a built-in, I think, paradox here between the whole notion of this kind of phenomenological take on creating architecture and almost the necessary reductionist approach of analyzing it and looking at what, are you gonna actually like have a palette of design moves that contribute somehow in a holistic way towards a sense of place or a spirit of place? Or is it something that just comes from within your gut and is kind of born whole as a vision of a place that has those qualities? Because I think that's kind of a built-in problem.
Can you go back to the little models you made and then we'll comment on that and then that next screen, this one and the next one. There is a danger with this thing that we mentioned, we talked about already a little bit, I just mentioned it, and it is that it's you have to be careful in this kind of an approach to design, I think, about the dangers of objectifying the subjective. I'll put it that way. And so, and we talked about how this really can't become elements of a design and represent a connection between the senses and the archetypes and so on and the design. But the next slide, the point occurred to me here, it's going to be, I think, work better if it becomes, in effect, a response to these senses of what kind of a feeling these aspects of existence, if you will, would have as an impact on your design process. So that it remains subjective, that you don't fall into the trap of objectifying it in a way that won't work.
I think his analytical approach is fitting because it's a thesis. And what you're hearing is you may not want to continue into conceptualization systematically, that all of your objective studies like this are preparing your spirit to make these leaps in the black box that maybe take you someplace these models don't necessarily point to.
Yeah, it's something you should do if you haven't done this already. I've got, if I mention this to you, listen to, there's a composer named Brian Eno, and he composed a piece of music called Moving Through Airports. And it's very cerebral, it's very kind of minimal and spatial, but it is an artistic, poetic response to a particular type of environment through the medium of music. You know, it's an analogy, you're kind of attempting to do that with architecture, and with light and space, and with movement. So you might listen to that and just kind of see how he went about doing it in his piece.
I kind of think you've done the easy part now, is that,
Yeah.
that big leap that you have to make.
Yeah. So I think we have been on the track, you know, he's been on the track of not trying to design all the baggage and the fuel and the, you know, how the surgeons would be able to do, I mean, all of that is, I mean, that's a huge, huge multi-year, multi-team design project. But to get into the actual substance of the building that relates to the human experience of moving through, of being in transfer from ground to sky, sky to ground, and so on.
And one of the really good resources for that was the ACRP's report 25, where they looked at passenger terminals and gave really good rules of thumb for developing these spaces based on in-plane passengers per year. So I kind of have that resource now.
So trying to get that put to rest and get into designing the main public spaces, yeah.
I could see you ending with something like a color-coded diagram of the airport master plan, and then you highlight the path and spaces that you're going to attend to, and one by one you elaborate on each one of those environments. I think, to me, I don't know whether you've done it yet, but a piece of this ought to be giving some attention to the present state of the passenger. I know you can't analyze individuals, but you can certainly surmise what mind states are in a baseline way in an airport.
And one thing I came across in one of my resources was in the design of an airport, right? Well, kind of the design, urban design, giving user scenarios for the final presentation. And so maybe a handful of them where you have different individual characters experiencing the spaces, and you tell very brief stories for each one of them.
You can have them walk through the space.
Businessmen.
Choreograph a little scene where they walk through.
That's not terribly poetic.
You know, that feels like the old book, Lawrence Halpern's book, RSVP Something. His wife was a choreographer, and he came to see design as a choreography of people and activities, and then he just wrapped the environment around what that choreography is.
That's what Bernard Shumi's talked about soon.
Yeah, but he used a poetic idea, like his fountain in Portland, yeah. He said it's the journey of water from the mountains down to the sea. These are the kinds of things that the water does, how it changes. So he had as his starting point an abstract idea, or sort of poetic idea that informed the whole thing. Then all that other stuff kind of fit around that. And I'm familiar with what you're doing because I gave you some of that what do you call it, kind of space that's
Not this.
you know, and you know, I think your challenge is to not make it that. Once you get into diagramming, this is where this happens, you know, and if that's your starting point, you're never going to get there. You need to have some just real insight as to what makes it not such a neutral place.
Need to move to the next one. Thank you.
Good day, my name is Daniela Lightburn. My thesis topic is on representation in architecture. It's basically about the role and the purpose of representation in making architecture. This is my basic diagram. It goes into, starts off with language and finding meaning and using language as a translational tool to understand architecture. And then within language is the way we represent our ideas through representation and concretizing those ideas using various, again, tools such as drawings and concepts, and today it would be 3D modeling, and historically it's been actually building full-scale models. Without language, we cannot speak. I was doing some research and I found this this image, and a lot of persons were trying to tell the meaning of the place, because it was never written about why the form is as it is. So I believe that within doing my thesis, the ideas will materialize into forms that will basically convert the intangible to tangible using icons and symbols. Historically, this is about changing models to drawings. Within language, there's this is the Dome of St. Peter's, and here it speaks about memorializing the martyrdom of St. Peter. So here is the site in itself has a metaphorical meaning for being there, and the dome is able to translate an experience from being something physical to being something that's experiential. This is a wooden model made by Sun Gallo of an early diagram of St. Peter's. I found it very fascinating that the size of the model, when compared to today's models that are basically screen size, to something that's incredibly massive. Here, there's a concept of converting models to drawings nowadays. But historically, they use models as a testing. So making models and conceptual diagrams is basically a testing of your representation. Within these models, there is a connection between the arts and other disciplines to further convey those ideas through art, film, and photography, drawing from them for ideas, for inspiration. Here is a painting of Paul, and Michelangelo is at the left side, and it's basically a relationship between a client and an architect. Because nowadays, we also do models for clients to understand better our ideas. Like the translation of language, drawings that are translated lose some of their meaning and connection. connection on the way. With the use of study drawings as an active tool in formulating design ideas, I believe that through this process that we can be able to fully understand an individual's ideas, what they're thinking. And at the bottom is a basic use of the computer as another means of conceptual diagramming. Possibilities can be brought into existence through a given medium. The bottom left is an image by Louis Kahn, and it's basically a perspective of the Mikvah Israel congregation. And as I was researching, there was a lot of information about how to do a perspective, how to include the individual, make the individual a part of the perspective. And here, he's basically above the audience, so there's a disconnect between the viewer and what's happening. And on the right is an image of it's a watercolor by Stephen Hall at the Museum of Contemporary Art. Here, he actually shows a ground plane. Although there aren't any persons in it, you can still have a sense of depth and being in the space. Like a builder, an architect needs the right tools for the job. And throughout history, these large instruments have been used to convey their ideas. But today, our tool is basically the use of computer modeling. Architecture is conceived, perceived, and experienced. Inspiration can be found in using photography and film. On the left is an image of, I can't remember this, but it's basically a photograph explaining about using photography and how photography translates. If you were to see the plan, you would be able to visualize a series of corridors and openings as they decrease based on the depth. It's called enfilade. The middle is an abstract drawing by, I think it was Nicolas. It also demonstrates distance and depth. It's a flat painting, but it's seen as a layering of ideas. On the right is a basic walkthrough of the St. Peter's SOA. With regards to precedents, I wanted through this process not to lose the meaning in translation and be able to use representation to express ideas, drawing for another to experience the way in which we draw. This is a conceptual drawings by Bernard Schumi of the New Acropolis Museum. It shows his ideas of using shapes to create views to the surrounding area. This is in Athens, Greece. And the bottom one is an example of the circulation within the building. And he further goes into trying to stay in context with the surroundings. Also, not disturbing this is above the excavation of above an historical excavation, so he used abilities to lift the excavation above, to elevate above the excavation's surroundings, and then the viewer is able to experience the space above and below. My approach was to most likely design a home museum with Boulay as a president. And because some of his ideas never materialized, and that would be my challenge, to use his ideas of extraction of geometric forms, effects of light and shadow, and the extensive use of symbolism to generate ideas of how the space would be if Boulay had given it. There's another drawing. And it's about materializing his unbuilt works and making architecture expressive of its purpose based on typology. This concludes my presentation.
So, you've got a lot of interesting images and drawings and models. Is there, we've talked about this as we've met, but is there some kind of an agenda here? Are you trying to show a relationship between the representation and the resulting design? Or are you showing how representation has evolved throughout history? Is there a thesis here, like something you're trying to prove or disprove, or?
It's basically to get a better understanding of the tools we use to convey our ideas. And by tools, it's not only language, it's also everything that we need to make architecture.
Yeah, I think there's been a shift here from where Jandina started to where she is now. And this whole idea of language is a new addition to what she's been doing. I personally, I think that the first part is quite interesting. I think once you get into all of these tools and things like that, it's a history of something, but I'm not certain what it means.
It's too unfocused right now. I mean, tell you what.
There are two fascinating things here that are possibilities, but I don't feel they're connected yet. One of them is that, in effect, the modes of representation have something to do with perhaps limiting or enabling different ideas of design. We design a T-squared, parallel, or whatever, and it tends to be that we go for the rectangular, right? Perhaps add a triangle to that, and that changes a little bit, and add an adjustable triangle, and a compass, and so on. So we extend our kind of vocabulary responsibilities by the means of representation that we have at our disposal. Partly a matter of convenience, and partly because that's just kind of how we begin to focus our mind. I think that's the point that the first part of it is really kind of trying to make, that there is a direct relationship between the modes of representation, the kind of design it allows us to do. That's one thing. And then suddenly we have Boulay at a house or a museum.
Well, you have that. Plus, you have this whole overlay of signifier, symbiotic language. Is there meaning in space because it's intended? Did Michelangelo intend certain particular meanings in the Capitaglia, or is it a spatial, physical orchestration? We find our own meanings. That to me is a very whole different thesis than representation, the tools that we use, and what design grows from this aspect of representation. I mean, the thing I go back to a lot, I was in college, was going on with New York 5, early Michael Graves in the 70s, because he was all about representation as architecture, a form of Cubist painting. And he started to look at buildings as three-dimensional explorations of Cubist painting. So I'm saying you go back and look at you don't have to be Michael Graves, but that's an example of looking at a way of representation, not just the tools you use, but a way of looking at the canvas or the space, and architecture emerging from that. But I think you touch on that and leave it and go a lot of places. I just think it's unfocused right now.
Yeah, I think the historical part that you're looking at, I think you're missing the boat on why you would look at history. And it has to do with the language idea. Each of those epochs that you were looking at has the architecture has an agenda. The language is serving something beyond itself. So you look at a Renaissance building, and it's not just a church, but it's serving this whole agenda of what the Renaissance was about perfection in the human body, and if you looked at Baroque, it would be something, and it's very logical. When you look at Baroque, and it's about expressing spirituality, because Baroque was a reaction to the Protestant Reformation, and the church was trying to, hook on to something that was different from what the Protestant Reformation was talking about. So I think that this whole idea of tools, and that's something you've been fighting all the way through this. I think that's kind of not a thesis, that's a technical book.
I guess I was wondering, does it lend itself to, I'm not sure what kind of design project this lends itself to. I'm certainly not sure about relay at the end.
Well, I think if you take the language part of it, and
Yeah.
the meaning and what you started out with, and how there's a direct correlation between meaning and representation, then I think that makes sense.
Yeah.
But I think once you get into, if you cut your thing off and stop looking at triangles and T-squares and those kinds of things, I think that's just a how-to, a cookbook. And this should be a cookbook.
The obvious connection is medium, like Roy said, medium in relation to outcome, or technique in relation to outcome. And I think that is a viable thing to explore, and I can see how it could evolve to something you do something about. Everybody's saying, okay, we get the language and the representation thing, but what are you going to do about it? It's a search for what you're going to do about it. Maybe there's some other twists, maybe, I don't know, I'm just thinking out loud. Maybe instead of struggling with medium and representational technique leading to architecture, maybe you shift it to architecture as representation of things. Then you get into Craig's semiotics and signs and symbols.
That's exactly what I was talking about when I talked about the Renaissance, and that
What it
architecture
represents.
had an agenda, and it had a language that it was using to get that agenda across.
And that, I think, is the thesis, could be a really interesting one. But maybe another one is equally interesting is you do a design application, you do it using collage, then you do it using computer modeling, you do it using,
Okay,
pardon?
Collage is taken.
Oh, really? You never do a collage again?
That's copyright. But all I'm saying is that, you assemble things with wooden fabric and say, what does this make? You assemble things, in the computer, you assemble things in Sketch. But that's a very different thing than some of the other things you can look at.
That would be so real. Yeah, seriously, because you then have to look at all of the ideas behind collage and.
Well, whatever ways of making you choose, that would be collage.
I think what's interesting, or what I thought you were alluding to in the beginning, because all of your beginning stuff seemed like, wow, this would be great for first year, just to show them, sort of all the techniques and all the, right, just to show them those things. But I thought you were kind of alluding to the differences historically to what's happening today, in terms of computer modeling. And I think that if you don't, it just seemed like that's sort of a natural thing, is to sort of look at that And because I remember when this is for the faculty, but when Derek was here, we argued all the time. He said, I can take a computer and I can do freehand drawing on the computer. And I said, I don't think that you can do it like you can freehand, you know? There's a difference. I still don't believe that. Maybe it's because I'm limited, but, you know, personally, and I know that I am, but that to me is sort of where I thought you were going, is what's happening today as opposed to what's, you know, not that that's a thesis either, because then you're just saying this is what is, but it might help you.
That could be a thesis if you really use those two modes, because you may have to be better at one versus the other, but sincerely use those two modes of investigation and see what emerges from that investigation. So that was a good thesis.
Is there some aspect of what you presented that you're more passionate about, or feel like you're more drawn to, or pull more out of, rather than that sort of?
So I started off kind of trying to figure out how to represent things and why. So that's where it started.
Well, there you go. Then it just makes sense to, I don't know, are you pretty well versed on the computer?
Okay.
You know, that could give you a concentration. The word that comes to mind when I hear what you said is embodiment, manifestation, realization. Bringing something that maybe is a murky, fuzzy, conceptual notion into the world in some physical form, whether it's a party model or whatever. Maybe your representational study is at that interface between the non-physical and the physical. And you do a series of exercises which have to do with non-physical conceptual things, and your effort to manifest those in some way. You know, just work the membrane between the non-physical and physical. It's another take.
And I think you sort of start that when you start talking about language, and that came really late, this whole idea of, you know, on the way to read about representation, we discovered language, and so now that got integrated into the thing. And I think that's really where there's a kernel of a seed that could really grow into your project. Then you could start to talk about Boulet's language, what he was trying to do, you know, why they call them the shadow architects, you know, and that might start to make that an appropriate application.
Well, that's what I was gonna say, that you're showing all this process and all these different approaches and representation. And then you jump to this, like it's so finite, it seems like there's a leap. But you know, the shadows, all those things are more things that you haven't discussed as part of this. I mean, I don't know whether you just haven't gotten to that, but that seems like there was a gray area that's missing to transition to this.
I started off in representation, so I'm basically kind of doing the opposite with my diagrams. I basically started off here, now I'm working outside, so that's yeah.
But if you're gonna end up with a, I mean, I think you need to now backtrack again in your research and look at what drew you to him, the shadows and the forms and the things, and then go back and do more research on those kind of representational ideas. So you have these themes that march through your research.
See, I think that diagram is not a good diagram. Okay. What that diagram should be is language as one thing, representation as another, and what happens in between. How do we get from language to representation? Or what's their relationship? And that's what you talked about at the beginning. The application, that's not part of That's not part of your research and the topic. That's just this thing that you're using to demonstrate what you're learning.
The big thing that's missing in here is what is represented and what is being communicated by language.
And what is
What is the
meant?
idea? Where does that fit into the diagram and what comes with that?
Well, to get smart on that, that's where you look at the histories. How has that
Yeah.
how has that dynamic evolved over time, or how has different times caused architecture to have one language versus another?
Certainly.
Because architecture is a meta language.
Yeah.
It's a language of
If
the
you've chosen
mind.
to do something about delay, then it's important to ask the question, why delay?
Yeah.
Why not something else? And to have focused on the idea would perhaps be where that answer is found.
Well, why not study these precedents of other representations, Renaissance, whatever, and contrast that with the current time, which is primarily a digital
In parametric design.
representation.
How does that-
See, language to me is the difficult part here. I'm gonna disagree with Professor Alfano, I'd drop it. Now, let me tell you why.
I don't know what it means.
Well, language is a two-way street. You know, language is not just what we intend and speak, it's what we receive and then assemble. So there's got to be a catch, not just a pitch that's thrown. And I think you just let that be whatever. You let other people determine what language you're speaking. But I think the Renaissance analysis is great, and you might look at some other, you know, whether it's early modernism, you have a Corbu painting, you know, whatever, like, essential, you know, representational methods that you use. You can't do the whole history of it, maybe you pick three. And then you look at what, I mean, because you're gonna be the one doing the representation at some point. And that's gonna be mostly digital, right? I'm asking you, so I'm not trying to say the word, so if that is, then there you go. Then the digital component has to be a part of it.
I disagree with you because that study of language then gives her some sort of an understanding of what her language is going to be. And I agree with you in that part. I think there's the study and the research, and then there's the application. I think you're talking about the application. Her language does not have to, what she designs does not have to be something that we all understand. Oh, that's contemporary language.
Oh, I agree. Her
But
application
she
will
has to
generate-
understand the
That's right.
nuances and how it's been done in the
Oh,
past.
yeah, I agree with that.
As a way of.
Yeah, yeah.
But we
So
really
that's
need to
the part
remember
I'm-
that if we don't have an idea, we don't need a language.
I'm not
think,
sure we all understand. I'm not sure we all understand that.
You've been very successful in getting the faculty to interesting discussion.
We need to call it to a close. It's 1:10. Thank you.
Oh, boy.